Well, it's good to be here today to tell you about this great project I've been involved with the state. I'm going to talk about the North Carolina-South Carolina boundary today, but there's a story about all of our boundaries, and they're all unique. So this is just a map showing you kind of the history of our boundaries, and what I'm going to tell you today is about how our boundaries ended up like they did, because if we went by the King's instructions, they would be totally different than they were today. Carowinds would be not being the state that it's split in today. So this was the instructions when there was one Carolina. The King in 1735 issued a decree of how the two states would be divided. So you can see from his instructions, it began at the sea, 30 miles from the river, go northwest to the 35th parallel, and then go to the Great Sea, to basically the west coast. So that was instructions that were given to the surveyors. So how did we end up like this? So the first survey started down the coast per instructions and went northwest in 1735 to 1737. And there's a lot of documentation about how they ran out of food, they ran out of a lot of things. In a lot of the writings you hear about, they always ran out of rum. They always took a lot of rum with them. So that was for safety issues. But for some reason, they stopped short of the 35th parallel in Sullivan County. They set what they call a pine stake there and stopped in 1735. We don't know why. We don't know if it was a mathematical calculations. We don't know if they just ran out of supplies and stopped. But for some reason, that set in motion why our state has the shape it is today. Because in 1764, the next survey crew came in to go due west to the Great Seas. And they started at the point which they thought was on the 35th parallel, and they went west, and they ran into the Catawba Nation's property. And earlier than that, the government had given the Catawba Nation property, and they ran into that property, and they knew they were too far south then. And so North Carolina, South Carolina said, well, we've got to correct this. So that's why you see that around Carowinds and Mecklenburg County, why they went around the Catawba Nation's property. And then they try to compensate South Carolina for what North Carolina got on this part. You can see they went farther north in the 35th parallel. And the green line there was done in 1772. They started at the end of the 1764 and then went west to what is today's Polk County. And then the last section was surveyed in 1815, starting at the point there, what we call, I'll show you a picture of it, called the blockhouse. It was a stone set there. Followed the ridge line to a point which was, at that point, was the Cherokee boundary, and then went down to the Chattooga River at the corner of the two states there. So that was in 1815. And then there was resurveys done in 1813 there. The original survey in 1772 followed what was called the Old Salisbury Road. And undoubtedly the road was deteriorating, and so in 1813, instead of following that road, you can see in that little section there in Union County, they just went a straight line and straightened that line out. And then there was two additional resurveys done in 1905 and 1928, and I'll show you there's some unique things why they did that survey in 1905 and then also in 1928. So I'll show you some slides of that. So next slide, please. So last survey, original survey done in 1813. So what happened all those years? Well, the two states didn't do a good job of maintaining it. It wasn't a real big issue when you had farmland, but when Charlotte started expanding, you have urban, it became very important to know where the state boundary was. So in 1994, my office is kind of like the state surveyor's office. We get all calls related to that. So we started getting calls saying, we're going to develop some property, where's the state boundary? Well, all we had to give them was this 1772 survey, which marked trees. Which was not a lot of help. And South Carolina has an office like us, since they were getting the same calls. So what really got it started was up in the mountains, Duke Power was going to sell a large parcel of land to North Carolina, South Carolina to create Gorgeous State Park. And each state was going to pay per acre. So obviously each state wanted to know what part was in there. So that's what started the motion to create the Boundary Commission and survey the property. And one thing I want to clarify, there is no boundary dispute. North and South Carolina agree where the boundary is from those original surveys. We're just kind of uncertain where it is on the ground. So this has been a team effort from the very beginning. North Carolina, South Carolina, So we're going to work together. We're going to reestablish this boundary. By the state constitution, we can't change it. The state constitution says the boundaries will remain as they're saying. So our job was to follow those original surveyors and reestablish it. And I'll show you some of the challenges we had to do that. So we started at the point A, which is on the Chattooga River, and worked our way down to the coast. So all the survey work has been completed. And I'll show you some of the impacts of this survey, especially when we get into urban areas. Okay? So that last section was surveyed in 1815. In 1813, commissioners from North and South Carolina went down the Chattooga River and marked a stone, and this is the stone here you see, latitude 30, as the 35th degree of parallel, is the beginning point. And then the survey was done in 1815. What's unique about this point is when you get back home, Google Walton's War, because the gentleman in the red coat is pointing to a stone called Ellicott's Rock. Andrew Ellicott was a famous surveyor, surveyed Washington, D.C. And before the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia and North Carolina had a kind of dispute of where the boundary was. So they hired Mr. Ellicott to determine where the 35th parallel was. And they actually took him like 20 miles into North Carolina, and he had to work his way down. And he supposedly set a stone there called Ellicott's Rock. And Phil is pointing to what everyone calls that stone. It's not the stone. In his letters, he describes it being on the other side of the river and a planted stone, but everyone thinks that's what it is. Next slide, and you'll see a picture of it. Everyone says that has the word letter N and the letter G, but it really looks like N and C to me. The reason we can't find a lot of his information was Georgia never paid him. They were not happy with where he put 35th parallel, so they didn't pay him. So we found a letter in the archives over here to our governor where Mr. Ellicott written a very distinguished letter saying the results of the survey greatly benefited North Carolina. How about paying me? And we didn't pay him either, so. Next slide. So we started there, and this is the end of that 1815 survey. This is called the Block House. This is in Polk County. That stone was set there, and you can see North and South Carolina on it. So in between that was the ridge line. And that ridge line was mapped. The map is 17 feet long. It's a very beautiful map. And so that was the first section we had to retrace. Next slide, please. Go ahead and do the next one. So in that map, it was mostly the ridge, a physical ridge. But in some places, they called for stones that they had marked. And there was one stone about 24 miles into the survey that they marked a stone on the south side with South Carolina, on the north side, North Carolina. So we took that 17-foot map and turned it in to georeference it today, and went out, and in an area about half size of this room, we found a stone. So they did a great job back in 1815 in doing that. But we felt kind of like Indiana Jones. If you could see, you can't see it very well, but there was about 3 inches of root mat on that stone. And when we pulled it back, you could start seeing the letters. And so it was a very rewarding experience. Go on the next couple slides and you'll see. So there it was at South Carolina AD 1815. And the next slide, a little closer, and go on to the next slide, and then on the north side. We figured out that North Carolina must not be paid as much because all we got on our stone was NC. They got South Carolina AD 1815. So we got that section finished, and the state bought the property, and Georgia State Park was created. And so then we started more urban areas because most of this was very rural, forested land, not a lot of development there, so not a lot of impact. So the next section was done in 1772. I'm going to the next slide. And this is the map that was created from the 1772 survey. And you can see where the Catawba Nation, kind of the square parcel here, and then went down to what was the river now Lake Wiley, went up and then went what was supposedly due west. And they marked trees every mile. So our job was to find where those original trees were at. Obviously, they're all dead. So what we had to do is go back and look for land records, sales of land, maps done around that time period of that survey. And so here's an example of some land grants that were issued within 10, 20 years of that survey. And you can see the one on the right called for the 19-mile tree, and the other one called for the 22-mile tree. So then we had to take those grants and put them on the ground today. So that's what we did all along that section there, and recreated that boundary. So we were able to do about 50 to 60% of the trees through there that we were able to take old records and bring them back and placed them where a property corner is today. And that's how we recreated that section in 1772, from the 1772 survey. Go on the next slide. And then part of that 1772 survey, remember I said they followed the old Salisbury Road. Well, this is the stone they set there, what's called the North Corner. This is near where the Andrew Jackson birthplace is, which is in North Carolina. And so this stone has been hit by cars a couple times. The local landowners have put a little fence around it to try to protect it. Okay. So the next section, the 1764 section, was similar to the 1772 section. We had to go back, look at land records, and find it. But this section here, Scotland and Richmond County, was resurveyed in 1905. So why do you think in 1905 we want to resurvey parts of Scotland and Richmond County? What was going on in 1905 in those areas?
Roads?
No, distilleries. Alcohol. So there was distilleries there producing alcohol, and I can't remember. One state didn't like distilleries, the other state wanted the tax for it. So the governor said, we need to know where the state boundary is. So the state boundary, they hired a surveyor, Mr. Purcell, he was a North Carolina surveyor, to reestablish that section of the state boundary. And this is his map. What's interesting about this map is we have never found the original. We found in the archives letters from Mr. Purcell reporting that he completed his survey, reporting that here's my letter, here's my map, but we can't find the map. So when we started the process, we looked, and I got a call one day from the Scotland County Register of Deeds. He said, I have a blueprint of a state line survey. And she had a blueprint of the original survey. We still don't know where the original's at. So we had this survey to go by. So at distinguished points, they set some very nice monuments. I'll show you some pictures of them. And then smaller monuments along the location. Mr. Purcell did a very good job. One thing he didn't leave us. He gave us distances from the very bend points at the end, but he gave us no distances in between the monuments. So it made it a little challenge to find those. So what we had to do is go back and look for surveys that had been done since 1905 that had tied their surveys to those monuments. And that helped us find a lot of them. So this is the monuments that were set at distinguished points, at turns, or at major road crosses. You can see has the governor's names, very large. These are 12 by 12 granite posts. So this made this section much easier to reestablish because it was monumented. And then the other points were these smaller monuments, 1905, that we found out there. We found about 40 to 50% of them. Lined up very well, so we were very pleased with the results of that. So the next section, the newest survey before we started was in 1920. this is one of the stills that was located along the 1905 survey. So there was also, South Carolina found some history where once the survey was done, they actually moved their distillery near the state line so they could make it one state and also sell it in both states. So that was the history about that section. So the next section was 1928. Go ahead to the next slide. And it was done because if you've ever been to Calabash and you take your boat out, you kind of have to go in now North Carolina, South Carolina. Well, undoubtedly back in the late 20s, the fishing laws were much different in North Carolina. So a lot of fishermen were getting tickets for illegally fishing in North and South Carolina. So their job was to monument the state boundary so that when law enforcement was there, they would know which state you were in. So in 1928, a survey crew started at the coast and worked their way inland to reestablish that 1735-1737 section. And when they got to near the end of it, they found a pine tree. And the landowner told them that just how old he thought this tree was. So the surveyors got permission to cut the tree down from the landowner. And when they cut the tree down and took a sample out, they found evidence of the tree had been marked around 1735 to 1737. So you can't see it very well, but in this over here, when a tree is was marked, it would actually grow over it. And you can count the rings and figure out what year it was. So we think that was from that original 1735, 1737 survey. So they set a very nice monument there depicting this is where the original tree was at. And then all along the other sections, they set 8-inch by 8-foot long granite posts at every 2-mile section. And this is one of the ones we found on Lake Waccamaw. You can see the river had washed it and it fell over. So part of our job was to reset, put it back in its original location. So 4 of us went down one day to pick it up and move it. Next slide. That's how far we moved it the first day. We didn't realize an 8-inch by 8-inch, 8-foot long granite post weighs about 800 pounds. And so we had to come back with some bigger equipment to get it moved, but we reestablished it back in its original location. Okay. This was a unique one. We actually found it. You can see in the background, we found it on the golf course at a tee. And when we did the survey work, it didn't line up right. It was offline. So we talked to the golf course, and finally they admitted they'd moved it. And actually made it look very nice. You can see they planed it with the black paint and the gold trim. So we took that original 1928 survey, the survey data, and computed where it should be. And we actually found the original hole they pulled it out of. And to prove it was the original hole, part of the monument was still, they'd broken it off when they put it there. So go back one slide. So it's back where in its original location of where it was. So this section, we started in 1994 and we finished the survey work a couple years ago. And think, what took so long? Well, each section had its own unique challenges. This section was much easier because it was monumented there. The 1772 section was much harder because we hired 2 firms, a North Carolina and South Carolina firm, to research. And state boundaries are not like your property boundaries. They're political boundaries. And so the data is in many locations. We had to go and look in people's will. It was just a lot of locations we had to look for to try to find that information. So we spent a couple years just doing research. So we worked, each section was approached differently. So that, because each one took a unique approach to do that. So the survey work's done. So why did we do this? Well, this is an example. This is, each county has their own partial mapping system. And this is in Gaston County, York County in the south, and north is Gaston County. The blue line is where York County thought the state boundary was. So you can see it kind of goes around that parcel. And the gold line is where Gaston County thought it was. So you can see it's supposed to be kind of a straight line, but it's not. And they're on top of each other. So this is the reason why we need to do this.
So going back to the landowner records, which go back quite a ways.
Right.
Did somebody owe somebody taxes back?
I'm going to get to that. And so we had to look at records. We thought when they surveyed this property in 1772, they more than likely cut a lot, it was almost like a road. And so we looked for records for the next 30 years because we thought they would still be visible there. So that .3B there was traced back to a survey. The yellow line is the reestablished boundary. And we use the word reestablish because our job was to put it back where it's always been, the monument where it's always been. So that .3B was traced back to an 1810 survey, which called for the state line. So this is an example of why we're introducing legislation now to minimize the impact. The building there that's labeled number 10 is a convenience store. Selling gas, fireworks, and beer. It's being taxed in South Carolina. But it's actually in North Carolina. So a big impact to this business owner. Fireworks are illegal. Selling gas at South Carolina tax rates. Gaston County is a dry county. So very big impact to this business. So what the Boundary Commission voted, yes, you have reestablished the boundary where it's at, but before you finalize it, we want you to develop legislation to minimize the impact. So there's 23 homes that will change jurisdiction. And so in our legislation that's over at Senate Bill 575, we are protecting those landowners from back taxes so that the state of North Carolina can't go to that property owner and say, you've always been in North Carolina, you owe us for 20 years of taxes. So we're protecting that. We're letting their children go to finish school. So we're trying to minimize the impact. We're doing some of the business on it. Go to the next slide and I'll show you some example. These are homes here. Number 2 is a home that, and you can see in the county map in it, there's a little gap there. Well, we saw that a lot. The property, there's no gap in the property. It's just in the mapping. So these landowners knew that their lots were partially in North Carolina and South Carolina, but in the case of number 2 here, they didn't know their house was in North Carolina. So this is where jurisdictional impact was. Number 4 over there, the boundary goes through someone's home. So which state, when a political boundary goes through someone's home, which state are they in? The only laws in North Carolina and South Carolina that deal with political boundaries going through the House are the election laws. And the election laws state that if a county or state boundary goes through your home, you vote in the county or state in which your master bedroom is. Okay. So we're working to clarify that so that there's 53 homes that the boundary goes through, 23 jurisdictional impacts. There's actually one warehouse that a very large company's warehouse that the boundary goes through, and I found out, and they knew it went through that, but I found out today why they did that, and it was a business decision that they could do partly for North Carolina business, South Carolina business. Because when you look at the map, you can see the building is clearly split by the state boundary, and it was done for a business decision. Another example, this is down in Columbus County. You can see up in the very right corner, the yellow line, that's where Columbus County had the state boundary, Horry County blue line. And then the red line, you can see this is one of the houses that the boundary goes through. So we finished the survey, we're working on legislation. Here in North Carolina, for me to get the boundary finalized, I do not have to go to the General Assembly. We have General Statute 141. And the process is I will take the survey to the governor. The governor then takes it to the Council of State, and if they approve, the governor issues a proclamation, and that is the reestablished boundary. And so we're waiting until we get this legislation to minimize the impact completed, and then to finalize the process. So my last slide is the question everyone always asks me, is south of the border still south of the border? And it is. It is. Except for one little awning on one building, it's all still south of the border. So now the Boundary Commission has instructed me to start the Virginia boundary, which will be, there's a story with each one of our boundaries. So I bet you didn't know that North Carolina-Virginia boundary has an offset in it. So look on the map, and in eastern North Carolina, the boundary goes and makes this offset and goes up. And the same thing with the Georgia boundary. There's an offset in it also. And there's a unique story of why our state at the Tennessee border has kind of a sudden straight line. There's a story behind that too.
How about the Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina corner?
It is monumented with a geodetic monument called Northwest Corner. I've been to it before. And actually there's a road built to it now that you can go there. But yes, it is monumented. Do you know what President's father surveyed part of our boundary in North Carolina, Virginia? Thomas Jefferson, Peter Jefferson's surveyed part of our boundary, North Carolina, Virginia boundary. So that's our next challenge, is to do that. And you ask, why do we need to do this? Well, modern mapping. We really need to know where the boundary is. And with our work being 200 years from now, they won't have to go back and do the research, because we have coordinates of every one of the points there. They're accurate to about a couple centimeters. So nobody in the future will have a problem of knowing where the state boundary is.
Lewis Act, you ever seen the TV show on the Discovery Channel, How the States Got Their Shape?
Right.
Okay, there's a lot of stories. I encourage anybody that's interested in this. But doesn't the federal government have any say-so in the dispute between states? Because I know there was a lot of controversy, and maybe not with North Carolina, but other Midwestern states, you know, just the stories you're telling and how the federal government had to get involved.
There is when there is a dispute, but
Okay, so as long as the two states agree.
right, and as long as we're put it back in its original location. Now, if we wanted to change it, we would have the federal government would get involved, and also we'd have to have some changes here in state law too. So, but as long as in South Carolina, they had a dispute with Georgia, and they spent over $10 million, and I think that helped them decide let's do it a different way in North Carolina, South Carolina. And like I said, it's been a team effort from the very beginning. No dispute. You see a lot of news articles saying border wars. Really not. It's just we've taken all this evidence and we will put it back on the ground where it originally was at.
Because there's a little section, I've ridden the Virginia Creeper Trail, you know where that is?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a monument there that talks about how there was a mistake made between Tennessee and Virginia, I think,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
where there's like this little cutout.
Yeah, and there was actually a boundary commission between North Carolina and Virginia for about 3 counties, I think Surrey, Stokes County, in the early 60s. And North Carolina never accepted the results of that boundary commission. We don't know why. So the North Carolina-Virginia boundary will probably be a challenge. Part of it was resurveyed in 1884 from the coast about 64 miles in, and we've recovered almost all those monuments. So that section will be fairly easy to do. The rest of it will be tough.
In the 1730, whatever year it was, I assume our western boundary just extended indefinitely?
It did until Tennessee was created. So the King's instruction was that North Carolina would go all the way to what you call the Great Sea. So we would go all the way across the west.
Well, if you go back to that original proclamation, it said 35th parallel, but we're well south of the 35th parallel.
Right.
If we were to go back to that, would Charlotte now be in South Carolina?
Is there an opportunity here?
No. That was interesting. We had our first public meeting. There was a lot of people there, which I was concerned with. And to come to find out, a lot of them thought we were going to put it back where the king had. We thought they were going to move it up. So no. The states have agreed on this where it was in the survey, but that original 1735 to 1737 survey, when they stopped short, then that's what set everything in motion.
And we gave up Carowinds for good, right?
Well, it goes through Carowinds. The boundary does, right through the middle of it. So.
That's great. Any other questions? This is fantastic.